This is a little beginner's guide to rotations, especially when we're playing volleyball in a 5-1. I'm going to focus a lot on serve receive, and the reason why is because that's when we do a lot of shifting around to try to get certain people to pass the ball and to free up our setter to get to the spot to be able to run the offense. This is a guide for both players and for coaches, mostly for those who are new to the game and maybe haven't learned about their positioning just yet. So where do we start? Well, in the beginning, there was the setter. Throughout this whole video, you're going to hear me talk about different rotations, and every rotation I talk about is going to start with them. Then, once we have them sorted, we're going to worry about where we position all of our best passers to make sure that we have the best possible situation in which we can run our offense. We want that setter to be able to have all options available to them, and that starts with a really good pass. Typically, although this might differ based on who you have playing for you, what level you're playing at, we pass with 3. That's just how we pass kind of in modern volleyball. Back in the day, we used to pass with just 2. Sometimes we throw in a 4th. There are pros and cons to each approach. When you add an extra player, there are more overlap areas to consider. So a little bit more complications thrown into the mix, but then you also have more area of the court covered. Whereas if you're passing with 2, it's a lot simpler. You get this half, I get the other half, but you've got to cover a lot more ground. So when we set up in receive, if we're passing with 3, this is one particular strategy we can use for determining who's got what area. Joe Trinzi posted about this on his Smarter Volley Substack a little while ago about his Mind Go methodology, where we have one person calling all the seams, typically your libero, because in this case, they're in the middle. They can call mine or go, and that just means mine, I'm going to go pass the ball. Go means it's the other person to my side. It's pretty straightforward, and it should be pretty simple. In practice, sometimes this can take a little while to get used to, and of course this is something you'll have to work with your players a lot to make sure that they can implement something like this. Something I found a little bit easier to introduce with my players anyway is this approach, which sometimes you might hear called hug the server. So we have our 3 passers again. Those arrows kind of stimulate their arms. And wherever the server is, if they start from their typical serving spot back there in right back, you just hug the server with your arms, and that's generally the area that you're going to cover along those 2 axes of your arms. If the server moves over to the left side, we shift a little bit in our positioning, and we still have roughly that same seam responsibility. I really like it if my libero can talk to the others, or even one of my really good passers as an outside can talk to the others and say specifically, I've got this seam, just so that they're all on the same page. It helps them get mentally ready to go pass the ball. So that's how we're going to manage actually the passing unit and how they work together. But this video is mostly about positioning and where we're going to be on the court. So we're going to focus mostly on side out, not break phase here. And these are the 6 rotations. And I'm going to go through what those mean. I'll have a little illustration of that next. But the very first one, we've got a few nicknames for them just so that it's a bit easier for the coach to yell out, maybe, or even the players to yell out at each other. Setter squashed, oppo squashed, hide the middle, just as an easier thing to remember. I do this even with my adult teams because, again, we all need that kind of mental shortcut to be able to remember, oh yeah, this is where we are. Rather than rotation 5, maybe we call that our best rotation, our fun rotation. So this is a sort of 30,000 foot view of what the rotations look like. We have rotation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're kind of going around clockwise there from the bottom right-hand corner. And we're naming them based on where the setter is. So here's the setter in each rotation. The reason why we're calling this rotation 1 followed by rotation 2 in the middle on the bottom there, is because that's the second position the setter's going to be in after their first position when they're back serving. Now, I've heard others call it the other way around, where we follow the zones of the court, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, where 6 is middle back. I use this convention. I think this might be an international standard. This is the one that I favor anyway, where we call it rotation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, going around clockwise, following the setter as they go around the court. So the very first rotation we're going to focus on is rotation 1. And this can usually be the most tricky for most teams running a 5-1. So this is what we start out with position-wise, typically. We have our setter in right back. We've just served. We've given the ball over to the other team. Now we have to pass. We usually have our strongest outside hitter in zone 2, so at the net on the right side. We have our second strongest middle blocker in the middle. We have our opposite over in zone 4. And in zone 5, back there in left back, we have our second strongest outside hitter. And then we have our libero usually in for our strongest middle in the back row. Now, strongest, weakest, sometimes that's useful. Sometimes it depends on the situation. If that outside hitter is particularly good at hitting on the right side, that might be why you have that outside hitter there. There are lots of things that go into deciding who's your strongest and weakest. But let's take a look at what this most often looks like when we're receiving serve. Those are going to be our 3 passers there. And when we get back in serve-receive formation, this is how we're going to organize ourselves. The blue circles are all the front row players. The green ones, including the libero, are our back row players. We call this one setter squash because they're kind of hiding behind that outside hitter in the front row. And if you have a look, there are our passers. We'll have a look at the overlap here. The orange lines are the front and back row overlap, so we can't have any of those circles connected by the orange lines in front or behind each other. The green lines are side to side in the back row, and the blue lines are side to side in the front row. So what we're illustrating here is that, for example, with the setter and outside hitter 1, setter can't be in front of the outside hitter 1. It doesn't matter left or right. The outside hitter 1 can't be to the left of middle blocker 2. But in this rotation, we don't have too many issues with that, especially if we're going to receive serve like this. As a receiving team, the most difficult place where we get into the most trouble is when people serve to zone 1 and at that outside hitter 1, because the setter is running to the net. That outside hitter has to go try to pass the ball, then also get out to the right side where maybe they don't hit quite as often. So they have to do a little bit more movement. We're just a little bit more vulnerable. There's more stuff going on over that side. So if we do get in trouble and we have a few issues with passing here, we might decide, do you know what? Let's reset. We're going to do a slight variation on this rotation 1 serve receive. So instead of having the setter squashed, we might squash that outside hitter. Now, usually your outside hitters are some of your best passers, so you don't like to do this too often, but in some cases, you need to change things up. I like to have my opposites able to pass so they can jump in and have the outside hitter shift over and the libero shift over. Now, we still have some overlap issues to worry about here. We want to make sure that the libero doesn't go to the right of the setter. So usually I have my setter keep an eye on the libero so that they don't cause issues. I want the libero focused on the server and have the setter do a bit of moving around. They can go all the way over to the sideline. They just have to make sure they stay behind or even with that outside hitter 1. So this is one pretty good alternative, especially if you have an opposite who's pretty decent at passing. So I may ask you to do this. If you play on a team for me, I may ask you as an outside hitter one to say, do you know what? You're going to squash up against the net. All you have to worry about now is just getting off the net and getting ready to hit on that right side when the serve comes over the net. Now, if your opposite is not a very strong passer, or maybe you really want that outside hitter to hit on the left side because that's where they're best, you can also have this variation where the opposite runs, or oppo runs. Again, we've still got to worry about overlap a little bit. It's a little bit more stretched. So we have everyone stacked over in the front row on the left side. And you can see the arrows get a little bit messy here. All those blue lines are very squashed together. We've got, in terms of overlap, that orange line, front and back. The outside hitter one is the one who has to be most aware of where they are. And the only person they really have to care about is the setter, because they're the player directly behind them in the rotation. Outside hitter one is in left front. The setter is in, they're in right front. The setter is in right back. Those are the only two players that have to worry about that overlap, front and back. Outside hitter one could be behind outside hitter two, and there's no issue there. It's just the outside hitter one and the setter that have to worry about being overlapped front and back. Now, we would have to potentially also worry about the opposite if they decided to come further down and maybe down around this area to hide. They could do that as long as they don't go to the side of middle blocker two. Then they would have to worry about not going further behind than outside hitter two. That's why if we just kind of stack them up at the net, we maybe have the opposite run alongside the net to get over to the right side. That might be a good option for you if your opposite can't really pass, or you really want that outside hitter one to pass and to hit from the left side. So these are three different variations on just the first rotation. We'll keep it a little simpler for the rest. There are loads of variations on all of these different rotations, of course, but these are the main ones, especially if you're playing for a team for me, that you'll have to think about. So whether you're a middle blocker, an opposite, an outside, a libero, or a setter, you should have a look at where you are in each of these so that when we are in this position, you know, oh, okay, cool. This is who I've got to worry about, who's in front of me, and who's to the side of me, and that's all. So that at long last covers rotation one. Moving on to rotation two, where the setter is in middle back. This one we call oppo squashed, just because they're pressed up against the net, because we want the setter to be as close to the net as possible, so they're kind of in base position and really just ready to run the offense from here. It's a little bit easier in terms of overlap. The only two really close calls there are the setter and the opposite, because they're right next to each other. And when we go to get ready to hit, the opposite is just going to shoot out here. Middle blocker is going to come around to run something in the middle, typically. And then this outside hitter two is the one in the front row. They're going to go attack on the left side. So rotation two is a little bit simpler in terms of people moving around and worrying about overlap. You do have to think, if you're the libero, about not stepping forward in front of outside hitter two. But otherwise, it's relatively straightforward. Over in rotation three, when the setter is way over in zone 5, or way in left back, this one can look a little funky, and if you have a referee who's maybe not familiar with the overlap rules, you might run into some issues. In this one, we have the middle blocker pressed up against the net. Remember, because the middle blocker one is right in front of the setter can't go closer to the net than middle blocker one. But where the confusion comes in is when they cross over to the right of outside hitter two, some referees will call it saying they're out of rotation and that the setter should be pressed up against the sideline with middle blocker one. That's not the case. they can go all the way over as far as outside hitter 1. So again, in this case, I have my setter have a look at where outside hitter 1 is and make sure that they're thinking about where they're positioning themselves. And they just set to give the middle blocker 1 a reminder, hey, you've got to be closer to the net than me. Just stay pinned against the net until that ball is contacted, then get off the net and get ready to attack. We can see the overlap here. The opposite can't be behind the libero. Usually that's not an issue. And in terms of the front row overlapping, again, usually not an issue. But for sure, this one looks a little strange, and referees will sometimes call it if they're a little inexperienced and don't quite know all the rules, because they'll see the setter squatting down in the middle of the court and like, well, something doesn't look quite right here. So just a heads up, and you can see that green line between the setter and outside hitter 1. That's just telling you that I have to make sure that I stay on the left side of that outside hitter 1. Now we're going to go through the rotations where the setter's in the front row. So we've only got 2 attackers. This rotation 4 we're going to call stack 3. That's where all of the front row players are pushed over onto the left side. I like to have my setter closer to the net than the middle, just so that they have an easier path, clear path to run to the ball. There's no tripping anybody up. If we have the middle at the net instead of the setter, sometimes one will leave early and they'll trip over feet. So I always tell my setter, just get closest to the net. You've got to be closest to the left sideline. That'll keep it simplest. Oftentimes I've seen setters holding onto the shirt in the middle just so that they don't leave early and use it as a force to propel themselves towards their own base position. This way we can have outside hitter hitting on the left side the whole time they're in the front row. And again, in terms of overlap, if we draw the lines out, this is what it looks like. The main thing that we want to think about is the opposite should, of course, know where they're supposed to be. They've just served. They should be pinned over to that right sideline and even back in the corner if they want. That's the easiest, because then there's no risk of them overlapping outside hitter 2. But if they do come in and you're passing with 4 and the opposite is up a little bit short to get the short ball over here in zone 2, you just have to remind them, don't go in front of outside hitter 2, who might be playing back a little bit further just so they get a bigger approach on that left side. That's usually the biggest issue. Whereas most of the other players, the setter and the middle blocker 1, they're pinned at the net. They're not going to overlap with those 2 players behind them in the back row. So this is a key. If you're an outside hitter, for me, and you're that outside hitter in the front row with the setter when they're over in zone 4, make sure you're pulling everybody over to the side so that we can get you in a good position to hit. In rotation 5, this is the one a lot of teams will start in because typically, like when we look at our stats, this is our best rotation by far, just because there's less moving pieces. If we have a quick look, the setter can start, and in base, they don't have to move. If we get a perfect pass, everything runs smooth. Outside hitter 1 drops off the net a little bit. They just can't be behind the libero because the libero is the player directly behind them. The opposite has to make sure they're between the libero and outside hitter 2 and not to either side. But otherwise, this is a pretty straightforward rotation. I know my middle blocker 1s love this rotation because they don't have to just hit in the middle. They can go run a slide behind. They can just attack straight away on a back set. So there's a little bit of flexibility here, and our setters are an active attacker as well here. So a little bit more straightforward. If we have a quick look at the overlap here, you can see the closest sort of danger zone here is the outside hitter 1 and the libero, just can't be in front or behind the other. And the opposite, of course, shouldn't be on the other side of the libero. If they do that, they'll get a real talking to, because they're just focused on getting ready to hit either a D ball or a C, depending what we're doing with the middle blocker one. The final rotation, rotation 6, this is where the setter is in zone 2. This is where we pull that outside hitter 1 over to the left side so they can hit kind of on their natural side. Again, this is relatively straightforward. And you can see where the opposite might get confused in the previous rotation. They might be just pinned over to that left side, thinking, I'm just hiding out of the way, getting ready to go think about hitting. Like this. This is what the overlap looks like, but the opposite can go all the way over to outside hitter 2 if they are going to wind up hitting a ball down this side. And really the key here is just to make sure that outside hitter 1 and outside hitter 2 don't overlap each other, because outside hitter 2 is in the back row, so that middle passer is in the back row. Outside hitter 1 should be a little bit shorter. So you just have to organize who's going to pass that short ball, make some accommodations. The libero can go up and take lots of short balls there because, of course, they have the freedom. The setter's typically going to be pinned to the net, so they can go all the way almost up to the net to make sure that they can pass that ball. So those are the movements that we're going to ask you to make when we're getting into serve receive, with a little bit of an idea about how we can organize that passing unit. Hopefully that's helped a little bit. I'll have a handout of this that you can download and print out if you like, poster it on your bedroom wall just so you remember where you're supposed to be in serve receive. There's nothing worse than getting called for out of rotation errors, being in the wrong spot, or struggling to figure out where is it that I belong. It's really good to go into a match going, look, I know where I'm supposed to be. I know my responsibilities as a passer in this unit, or even just as a hitter, and getting to my spot and where I need to be to hit the ball. It's really important to have that stuff down before we go into any big competitions, because otherwise you're going to struggle, and it's going to be very difficult to remember this stuff in the heat of the moment. And if you're focused on that, you're not going to be focused on making sure you get out and get a good attack on the ball, or from first principles, you're not going to get a decent pass on the ball. Our setter is going to be running off balance, and right away we're going to be off balance, and it's going to be much harder for us to score points and get that ball back and win some games. So please have a look. Make sure you know where you're supposed to be. That's the key. And for coaches, same. Make sure your players have a good idea going into the match where you want them to play. And if you notice that a server is hitting a particular area and you need to adjust, like we have our different options for rotation 1, it's a really good thing to make sure that your players know where they can play in that type of scenario, to make sure that they're as flexible as possible and they're in a good position to handle lots of different scenarios in a match.